this learning stuff from entities is not respectable in our present official intellectual world. But when you start asking questions, you'd be amazed where entities have acted and with what force. For example, this is, to my mind, one of the great suppressed stories of modern history. In August of 1619, a retreating Habsburg army camped in Ulm in southern Germany for a few days. They were retreating from a campaign against Prague, where they had successfully deposed the Winter King and Queen. And in this group of troops, of several thousand troops, was a young French adventurer, 22-year-old soldier of fortune. And that night, the night of August the 12th in Ulm, he slept and had a dream. And an angel appeared to this young man and said, "The mastery of nature is achieved through measure and number." This was René Descartes. This was the founder of what is called materialism, rationalism. His marching orders were given to him in the same way that Muhammad got his marching orders. All of modern science was created at the behest of an angelic entity. Well, they're not talking about this at Caltech and MIT, let me tell you. So how many times in history have voices taken the wheel? Another example, one that's dear to my heart, is, because I kind of identify with it, is Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a poor surveyor from Devon who was out collecting insects in Indonesia in the last century, and he got a fever on the island of Ternate, malaria. And in the midst of this fever, he understood the solution to the great problem of 19th century biology, which was called the problem of the species. He saw how random mutation and natural selective forces could produce biological diversity. And when he came down from this thing, and this was again an angelic deliverance in the height of this fever, he couldn't figure out what to do with it. So he wrote a letter to the greatest scientist of the age, which was Charles Darwin in London. And when Darwin opened this letter, he just said, "Holy shit. This guy has scooped me. 20 years I've been working on the origins. Here it is in 4 paragraphs. Who is this guy?" Well, so then it became the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution for its first 50 years, and then Wallace dropped out of the picture because he disgraced himself by an interest in spiritualism. But you can understand why, if the guy got the original vision from an angel.
Can I come in on spiritualism?
Sure.
Mackenzie King, who was Prime Minister of Canada for about 40 years, all through the war, it was always kept secret that he was totally a spiritualist. And even if you read history since the war, when he died, suddenly everyone discovered this, and then there's been a terrific clamp on it again. But I know Canada's a small country, but the Prime Minister of a country very involved in decisions on war was getting most of his stuff from spiritualism.
That's right. This is part of what I was talking about last night with the time wave. The alchemical dreams of the 16th century, of the Philosopher's Stone and all that, never really died. Instead, the triumph of secularism and so-called modern science, post-Newtonian science, pushed the dream somewhat into the background. But after James Clerk Maxwell and Helmholtz and those people discovered the electromagnetic fields in the 1870s, we are totally intellectually at home with the idea of electromagnetic radiation. We don't see what an occult thing it must have seemed to the 19th century, where they had just risen to the place where they conceived everything mechanically. Hard objects whizzing through space, force, angular momentum, conservation of energy. Well, then comes Helmholtz and Clerk Maxwell and these people, and they say, oh no, there's a diffuse, invisible, vibratory medium that extends throughout all space, and just, complete occult kind of vocabulary. Well, that has now, because it could be formalized through Maxwell's equations for magnetic radiation, somehow the occult side of it dropped away. For us, that's how you take the magic out of something, is you stride to the blackboard and write a tensor equation of the third degree, and then somehow you have it. So these fields became very mundane and could be used for radio and television and so forth. It took someone like Marshall McLuhan to point out that the Christian program for the entry of God into history reaches the period of the intercession of the Holy Ghost once Marconi throws the switch. That the electrical web of noetic information, the instantaneous transformations of the global logos, this is the age of the Holy Spirit. And, it's a funny thing how effects in nature can be drawn forward and concentrated. For thousands and thousands of years, electricity was understood to be that thing that you see when you take a cat skin into a darkened room with an amber rod and rub the cat fur with the amber rod, and then as you stroke it in the darkness, you see static electrical discharge through the cat fur. And this was known since Hellenistic times. It was a magic show demonstration. But it took the concrescence of novelty, the descent of the Holy Ghost into history, to draw the crackle out of the cat fur and set it as an envelope around the planet, transducing the information that knits together the dominant species. Well, how many things lie about us, present at hand, ready to be somehow reconfigured in some salutary or salvific way. One of the insights that I had from all the fiddling with shamanism in the Amazon was that everything can be simple. If things aren't simple, we haven't thought about it long enough. That's why I liked that population idea yesterday, because there may be a yet simpler idea than that, but that really gives me hope, because if you don't have a simple idea, you can be pretty sure you don't have the solution. The solution is going to have to be pretty simple and straightforward, because it's going to have to be executed by the combined commitment of millions and millions of people. No, it's a penetration of the collectivity. I mean, you can really feel it. It's really there. It's the aura of the human and biological envelope of the planet. And I don't know how deeply you can read it. I mean, obviously, like the time wave is, for me, it's a kind of blueprint of the thing I see in hyperspace. It's a CAD/CAM sketch of the philosopher's stone, or of the transcendental object. That's the kind of shadow it throws. But it's the whole collectivity. You know that, I can't remember who wrote this poem. I think nobody very interesting. It's kind of dismissed as doggerel. But do you know that poem, I saw eternity the other night, a golden ring? Well, the wave is eternity as a golden wave. It's that all time is a standing wave in eternity. Plato said this. He said, time is the moving image of eternity. Means that eternity is some kind of higher dimensional object, and the present is like a wave moving through this, moving around the donut of eternity. And the time wave then shows the fine structure in this donut. If you could assimilate this idea and expand it and connect its vocabulary to the vocabulary of the perennial philosophy, I think you would see that they're saying the same thing. They're saying, everything already exists in some higher dimension, yet there is free will within certain constraints, and somehow the task of self-growth or spiritual understanding is to get a perspective on this, get an image, to become all space and all time. That's what those guys and gals sitting there for 40 years in Zazen must be looking at. They have become everything, not in some metaphoric or pissant way, but they have become everything. And and they've done it through an act of identification with the internal image of the totality. I mean, this sounds to me awfully, almost, it's too airy-fairy, but it's because we don't have a control language for it. But it's a real thing. We must learn to be able to command the image of the totality.
So the notion being developed here is that within the structure of the human psyche, there is something like a governor, something like a monitoring circuit, which when a society begins to evolve in a pathological or lethal direction, phenomena can be induced not by the egos of men and women, not by their institutions, but by the overmind, the collectivity of the human species. Phenomena can be induced which are so corrosive to the ideologies currently in place that their underpinnings are cut away, their validity is called into question, and their programs for social development and control are invalidated and destroyed. Now, a perfect example of this is the rise of infant Christianity. If you'll cast your mind back to the situation in the early years of the Christian era, and imagine the mentality of a Roman aristocrat, a person of power in Roman society. Their physics is drawn from democracy and atomism. In other words, they are thoroughgoing materialists. Their social theory is drawn from Epictetus and Plato. They are, in fact, extremely modern people by our own standards. However, among the gardeners and kitchen help and stable boys, there is news of a momentous event in the Middle East. A Jewish rabbi has triumphed over death and risen after 3 days in the tomb. Should the master of a Roman household have caught wind of this kind of superstitious talk among the help, he would have just dismissed it with a sneer. What a preposterous idea. And it is a preposterous idea. Nevertheless, the fact that an idea is preposterous has never held it back from making zealous converts. And within 120 years after the Annunciation of the birth of Christianity, its missionaries were beating on the gates of Rome, attempting to convert the emperor. Now I see a similar situation in the modern context, that rationalism, scientific technology, which began and came out of the scholasticism of the Middle Ages and the quite legitimate wish to glorify God through an appreciation of His natural world, turned into a kind of demonic pact, a kind of descent into the underworld, a Nekeia, if you will, leading to the present cultural and political impasse that involves massive stockpiles of atomic weapons, huge propagandized populations cut off from any knowledge of their real histories, male-dominated organizations plying their message of lethal destruction and inevitable historical advance. And into this situation comes suddenly an anomaly, something which cannot be explained. I believe that that is the purpose of the UFO, to inject uncertainty into the male-dominated, paternalistic, rational, solar myth under which we are suffering. So, I suppose if you had to categorize this point of view, you would say I'm taking a depth psychological, psychoanalytic point of view. What I'm saying is that the UFO is nothing more than an assertion of herself by the goddess into history, saying to science and paternalistically governed and driven organizations, you have gone far enough. We are going to turn the world upside down. Your science is going to be shown up for what it is. Nothing more than a pleasant metaphor usefully extrapolated into the production of toys for healthy children. That's what science is good for. It is not some meta-theory at whose feet every point of view from astrology to acupressure to channeling need be laid to have the hand of science announce thumbs up or thumbs down. Now, there is another possibility which can be dovetailed into the first. It is that it is not so much the oversoul or the superego of the human species which is responsible for stopping scientific masculine paternalism in its tracks, but rather that, unbeknownst to self-absorbed and myopic human beings, we have always shared, or at least for a very long period of time, have shared this planet with another intelligent species, another entity, which may have been perfectly content to allow us to abide in our ignorance of its presence until the point where it came to its awareness that our style was toxifying, ruining, raping, and perverting the planet. And at that point, this thing springs into action with similar end results as the previous scenario, the invocation of the superego. It's astonishing to me that in the 45 years that the UFO, are we being visited question has been kicked around, I have never seen in any UFO book or publication the suggestion made that if we believe we are being visited by organic, intelligent life forms from some other dimension or place in the galaxy, then we should very, very thoroughly examine the ecology of this planet for traces of its presence. What assurance do we have that the several million life forms that we know to exist on this planet all evolved here? Do we have any assurance? There are ways to gain that assurance by doing comparative DNA sequencing and this sort of thing. Some of you may know my own position, or one of my positions, which is that plants and fungi containing psychoactive compounds are extremely viable candidates for extraterrestrial intruders into the environment of this planet. And this is not to put down Whitley's story, which is a very interesting story, but had he prefaced his story with the comment that before it all happened he took 5 grams of mushrooms, I doubt he could have sold it to his mother. Because in the world where mushrooms and other psychedelic plants are imbibed, such stories are commonplace. It's no big deal. So I'm always amused by UFO investigators and compilers of data who will tell you, well, the first thing we did is we got rid of all the stories told by anybody who was intoxicated on anything. it seems to me that move has probably absolutely precluded any possibility of understanding what is going on. You see, culture is something that we wear like clothes. And we're very much at ease with culture. Our mind is very much at ease with culture. And we gather the language of a given culture around us. Culture is the mind unperturbed. When a shaman or an ecstatic visionary goes into the wilderness and through ordeal or yogic practice or breath control or the taking of a psychoactive substance perturbs the mind, then we see what the mind is out naked, undressed from the clothing of language and convention. That's why I've made this point over and over again. There will not be a serious discussion of the origin of UFOs, or for that matter, of the nature of consciousness itself, until we leave the utterly culture-bound, provincial, and hick-like attitude that science has foisted on us about perturbing the mind. Without the use of psychedelic substances, I think solving the UFO dilemma is going to be as thankless a task as attempting to understand the nature of the universe without availing yourself of the use of a telescope. It is simply tying our hands behind our backs. Now, there is a third possibility, which is the one that is the more commonly entertained notion, which is simply that we are being observed by intelligent life forms that evolved somewhere else in the galaxy. They have quarantined our planet to keep us from being agitated by their presence, and they will eventually reveal themselves. I find this an extremely odious notion, especially the part about how much chaos there will be if the truth is ever revealed. This is nothing more than the reassertion of masculine paternalism, its right to keep secrets from the rest of us, its belief that there is a privileged all-male class of people who can be let in on what's really going on, and the rest of us, poor dears, have to be shielded from these tremendously shocking facts. I discussed this once with an entity, and it said to me, well, you know, we've disguised ourselves as an extraterrestrial invasion so as to not alarm people with what's really going on. We're getting close to the end, folks. There is a fourth possibility, which I mention only in the interest of thoroughness, which is that these entities and their vehicles are not spacecraft at all, but are in some sense time craft, and that we may be the tremendous sense of empathy with these quite physically unusual beings may arise out of the fact that we're looking into the faces of our great-great-great-grandchildren, who may be emanating back through time, carrying the message, a message about some sort of future event or situation that lies many centuries downstream from us, but that is of such import that from that point, agents are moving backward and possibly forward through time, spreading the news of some kind of mode shift. This doesn't seem to me to be impossible. However, based on my own experience, which is what I think this thing really comes down to, because what we have in the UFO issue is an official position supported by scientists, whether they be Neanderthal right-wingers or doctrinaire Marxists or whatever, a conspiracy of consensus against the personal experiences of individual human beings who are told, well, what you're saying happened to you can't have happened. You are insane, you are mentally ill, you are mistaken. So what we really have here is a political issue. Which do you believe? Your perceptions, memories, and expectations aided by your intellect, or some kind of utterly abstract, official, doctrinaire, sexist philosophy laid on from above. So I think really what the saucers do, if you accept their presence, is they empower us. They empower us to see science for the shell game that it is, to see the past 400 years of Western culture for the pathetic narrowing of the spectrum of allowable phenomena that it is, to the point where people think that if you can't bang on something with a hammer, it isn't real, which to me is just wild talk. I can't even imagine where that this thing is coming from. So I think, and I'll just leave you with this final thought, that in lieu of the repression, and it is a repression throughout this century, of legitimately available ways of exploring the modalities of consciousness, and by that I mean psychoactive compounds, the repression of those compounds and their use by science has created a neurotic energy dynamic in the mass psyche. And the mass psyche has begun to hallucinate because the destiny of human beings is to live in the imagination in the hands of the goddess. And wherever that thrust is impeded, psychopathy will result. There will be neurosis. There will be psychic epidemic. There will be confusion. So I believe that until we form a resolution to conduct an unfettered and mature exploration of the human psychology using all the tools available to us, that the skies of Earth will continue to be haunted by flying saucers. They will continue to be haunted by flying saucers and their denizens because they are symbols of our infantilism, of our sense of loss, of our incompleteness. And we can heal that breach by simply recognizing that the true mystery lies within us. The true mystery is in the mind, and its historical promise is the transformation of our society through the abandonment of reason as it has been narrowly defined by this extremely solar, masculine, paternalistic, materialistic legacy that we are the victims of. Well, I could talk for a long time, but I think that's it in a nutshell. Thank you. Thank you.